Let's dive straight in.
Section 7. Drinking unfiltered water.
Turn on the tap, fill a glass, and drink. Easy, right? But did you know that just a couple hundred years ago, drinking water like that could have been a death sentence? Back then, most people had no idea what was in their water. Wells, rivers, even city fountains were loaded with bacteria, parasites, and waste. Would you drink from a river today if you didn't know what was upstream? Diseases like cholera and typhoid spread like wildfire through contaminated water. In London's 1854 epidemic, thousands died in weeks just from one pump. Can you imagine a whole neighborhood wiped out by a single well? Even in the US, cities didn't fully adopt treated water until the 1900s. Could you really trust a glass of water back then? Not at all. Today, filtration and chlorine make it safe, so we never think twice. But what feels like a basic right now was once one of the riskiest things you could do.
Section 6. Eating bread or grains.
Grab a slice of bread today, and it feels like the safest, most boring food you can eat. But a few centuries ago, that same slice could have carried a death sentence. Before modern milling and storage, grains often got contaminated with mold. One of the worst culprits was ergot fungus, which grows on rye. Have you ever heard of the dancing plague in medieval Europe? That bizarre outbreak was linked to people eating ergot-contaminated bread. Ergot poisoning caused convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. Whole communities suffered just because their harvest had been infected. Imagine biting into your daily bread and not knowing it was slowly poisoning you. It wasn't just ergot either. Insects, dirt, even stones could sneak into flour before industrial milling cleaned things up. The pure white flour you take for granted today simply didn't exist for most of history. Now, bread is one of the safest and most controlled foods on the planet. Factories test flour, add preservatives, and package everything airtight. But every time you eat a sandwich, remember, the same habit once carried risks we can hardly imagine now.
Section 5. Having surgery or a tooth pulled.
Today, getting your wisdom teeth out or having a minor surgery is almost routine. But just a little over a century ago, either of those things could have killed you. Before modern anesthesia and sterile tools, surgery was fast, brutal, and incredibly risky. Can you imagine lying on a table with no painkillers while someone cut into you? Surgeons worked quickly because the longer the procedure, the higher the chance of infection. Tooth pulling was just as bad. Barbers, not dentists, often did it with dirty pliers. Have you ever thought about how something as simple as a cavity could once spiral into life-threatening infection? Without antibiotics, even small wounds in the mouth could spread to the bloodstream. Hospitals weren't much safer. Doctors reused instruments without washing them, and no one wore gloves. The germs you worry about today on a doorknob were literally being put inside people during surgery. That's why mortality rates were shockingly high, even for minor procedures. Now, with sterile equipment, anesthesia, and antibiotics, most surgeries are safe and routine. But every time you sit in a dentist's chair or sign hospital paperwork, remember, your ancestors were rolling the dice on survival.
Section 4. Childbirth.
Today, childbirth happens in clean hospitals with trained doctors and emergency equipment on standby. But for most of human history, giving birth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do. Before modern medicine, midwives did their best, but infections, hemorrhage, and complications were common. Can you imagine bringing a child into the world knowing there was a real chance you might not survive the night? Mothers didn't have access to blood transfusions, antibiotics, or surgical interventions like C-sections. Even something routine today, like a breech birth, was often a death sentence for both mother and baby. And it wasn't just the lack of medicine. Many births happened at home, with no sterile tools or clean water. The germs you'd scrub off your hands today were literally entering women's bodies during labor. That's why maternal mortality was heartbreakingly high until well into the 20th century. Now, most births are safe, and survival rates for mothers and babies are higher than ever. But every time you hear a newborn's first cry, remember, not long ago, that sound was far from guaranteed.
Section 3. Simple infections or scratches.
Get a paper cut today? You wash it, maybe slap on a Band-Aid, and move on. But a tiny scratch like that could have been fatal just 100 years ago. Before antibiotics, infections spread fast and unpredictably. Can you imagine a blister from new shoes turning into a life-or-death situation? For many people, that was reality. Small wounds often led to blood poisoning or gangrene. Even dental abscesses or skin boils were killers. Have you ever thought about how a pimple or sore throat could once mean the end of the line? Without penicillin, doctors had no way to stop bacteria once it got into the bloodstream. Hospitals weren't a guarantee either. Amputations were common cures for infections in limbs, and survival was far from certain. The germs you shrug off today with a pill were once powerful enough to take down kings and soldiers alike. Now, thanks to antibiotics, most of us barely think twice about cuts or infections. But every time you open that little orange pill bottle, remember, it's the reason a scratch doesn't carry a death sentence anymore.
Section 2. Traveling long distances.
Booking a flight today? You grab your phone, pick a seat, and a few hours later you're across the country. But traveling long distances used to mean risking your life every single time. Before cars, planes, and trains, journeys were made on horseback, wagons, or wooden ships. Can you imagine setting off on a trip knowing you might never make it back? Disease, accidents, and even simple exhaustion were constant threats. Sea travel was especially brutal. Storms could sink ships in minutes, and scurvy killed thousands of sailors before vitamin C was understood. Have you ever thought about how eating an orange was once the difference between life and death on the ocean? Even over land, danger was everywhere. Bandits, broken wheels, starvation. What feels like a road trip today was once a gamble with nature and fate. The luxury of movement you enjoy now was a deadly challenge just 2 centuries ago. Now, air travel is statistically the safest way to get around, and long road trips are more about playlists than survival. But every time you buckle your seatbelt, remember, you're doing something your ancestors considered a dangerous leap into the unknown.
Section 1. Eating potatoes or tomatoes.
French fries, ketchup, mashed potatoes, stuff we eat without a second thought. But did you know these foods once terrified people enough to think they were deadly? When Europeans first encountered tomatoes in the 1500s, they were convinced the bright red fruit was poisonous. Can you imagine refusing spaghetti sauce because you thought it might kill you? The metal plates used at the time reacted with tomato acidity, making wealthy diners sick and reinforcing the myth. Potatoes had their own stigma. In some regions, they were linked to leprosy, witchcraft, or straight up considered unsafe. Have you ever thought about how a baked potato could once spark panic instead of comfort? People avoided them for decades, before slowly realizing they were not only edible but life-saving. By the 18th century, potatoes became a staple crop, feeding millions and helping prevent famine. Tomatoes, once feared, turned into the base of global cuisines from Italian to Mexican. The same foods you treat as cheap, everyday carbs were once suspected of being killers. Now, we can't imagine a world without fries or pizza. But every time you dip a fry in ketchup, remember, these safe foods had to survive centuries of suspicion before earning their spot on your plate.